Hey guys, it's Kent, and this week we are talking about the Vikings. Now, this is a request from one of your classmates, so I hope you enjoy. So, to get through all the basics of the Vikings, let's go through a really quick information dump. We have very limited history of the Vikings from their perspective. The limited information we do have comes from things like runes, which are a traditional writing style and method of transcribing information throughout generations. We have the sagas, which are kind of a pseudo-history, so that would be kind of like the movie version of the history of the Vikings, because it was written a long time afterwards, and the actual information was not written by credible sources. So it's kind of the culture that existed of those people that lasted throughout time, which is why it is still important, even though it's not necessarily accurate information. And then the final piece of history we have is written by the people who lost against the Vikings, which is odd. You know, when we think about it, we always think history is written by the winners, but in the case of the Vikings, it's written by the losers. And this happened long after also in many cases, and many of those people use the victim perspective when writing about the Vikings. And while we're talking about the Vikings, we have to talk about the word Vikings, which means kind of like a sailor word, but it's not actually a group of people. It is a lifestyle, really, very similar to what we think of as pirates. They were known as heathens, Danes, Northmen, the Rus, the Varegans. I mean, there's so many different words that they use to describe these people. And I guess to skip ahead, we're just kind of talking about people who came from this area-ish and attacked this area-ish, or traveled to those areas. So why do we study the Vikings? Well, they were big on things like raiding, trading, and extorting. And later on, to a smaller extent, colonizing and settling. But it did eventually have a major impact after the interaction with the Carolingian Empire. So there's no single power or government that existed in this area at the earliest time periods as far as the Vikings go. They would eventually be unified, which would cause their demise. Spoiler alert. But this area was made up of smaller villages. Most of the Vikings were farmers, the people that we call the Vikings. Women had better rights than most people, but we still have slavery happening. And actually, part of the conquest was about obtaining money in order to fight more in their region that they came from, and the slave trade helped fund those armies to take power. This is a quick little map giving you a little area of everywhere that was impacted by the Vikings of different kinds. And we will go into a little more detail, but I do suggest you looking some of this stuff up. It's very interesting. I learned a lot. So to make this PowerPoint as boring as possible, I'm going to throw a ton of numbers at you real quick just to give you some general idea of the time period we're talking about. But as everything else in this class, numbers are not as important as the concepts that we're discussing. Most importantly, we start the Golden Age of Viking, which is not a real thing or a word, around 793 with the invasion of Lindisfarne, which I'm not saying correctly, but it is a holy area in the northern part of England, way up here. And it had a monastery there full of monks, and Vikings showed up, completely destroyed this place, took all this gold and whatnot. And it was because it was not heavily protected, because the English at the time thought that God would protect these sites. So why have soldiers there? You have, God to protect this information, or all these relics and all this other important artifacts from Christianity. But it did not go over well for the monks. They were slaughtered. This loot was taken back. A lot of the monks were taken and sold into slavery. And that is the first major thing that swept through Europe, kind of warning them of this group of people from the north that came and attacked them. But guys, like I said, this was not the first interaction of the Europeans or the greater Europeans with the group that we call the Vikings today. But it is the most influential of the time. And like I said, historically, this is when they consider the Viking Age to start. So to hit some really important numbers, in 860 we had a great army. They created this this kind of empire called Danelaw, which is kind of like a portion of England. In 874, Iceland is settled. In 958, this guy named Harold Bluetooth unites Denmark. He is important in this because the Nordic letter H and the Nordic letter B put together equals Bluetooth, because Harold Bluetooth his initials, and this is a symbol for the thing that unites all your electronics together. Just thought that's an interesting concept to know. We have Eric the Red, who was kicked out of Greenland for murder. His son, Leif Erikson, in 1001, discovered America for Europeans. It was already inhabited. And he made some temporary settlements there, but they didn't exactly last. In 1013, England is conquered. They create this House of Denmark. In 1028, this is completed in the largest empire known as the North Sea Empire, the largest empire that includes the Viking groups. In 1035, this empire is broken up after the king dies, and then in 1066, which is the end of the Viking Age, Harald Hardrada dies, and thus ended the Viking Age. One of the big speculations is Vikings no longer needed to pillage and burn because there was other more profitable methods of making money, and they did not need that money to unite this empire anymore. So that whole Viking era ends here, kind of as a result of Christianity, kind of as a result of the world just opening up. So let's talk about two major things that happen that are kind of important. The first is when the Vikings attacked this area in France called the Carolingian Empire, which is modern France, in the early 1800s, or early 800s, I apologize. They target them because they were easier targets. Now, the Carolingian Empire was split between these three brothers with little coordination because they had their own little war going on for supremacy. And so the Vikings swept in and just kind of conquered a bunch of stuff or defeated a lot of their armies. And eventually one of these kings had to give them a huge swath of land, which would eventually be named Normandy. And for those World War II people, you know, the invasion of Normandy, when the Allies had D-Day, that took place there in this area. And that was actually a settlement of Vikings, which is very interesting. And William the Conqueror, if you know much about him, he is from that area. He was technically an ancestor of Vikings. So the other important concept was the Viking invasion of Constantinople in 860. Now, this was an unsuccessful attack, but if you think about it, people were coming from way up here, going down the seas here, or going down the rivers here and here to the Caspian and Black Seas. And when they got here, they actually attacked Constantinople. And while it was unsuccessful, it did make a huge impact on the world, and it did teach them a lot about trade in this area and about the people in this area. And they settled a lot near Constantinople and set up trade areas. And the other thing is, part of these Vikings known as the Rus, they settled places like Kiev, which had already been settled. They just further settled these areas. And Rus would eventually become what we think of today as Russia, named after the Rus Vikings. So these were very influential groups. The last little thing from the Constantinople campaign is the Varangian Guard. Sorry about the pronunciation. One more time. This was an elite group of Viking men who served to protect the king of Constantinople. This is kind of cool to think that they made such an impact. So let's talk about some of the weapons and the influence of the Romans on the Vikings, because of course this is happening all after the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Romans had made such an impact on the area. Now, shield walls such as this one featured here, which were very famous for the Romans in the Testudo, were still being utilized. Only the richest people had swords, but these swords were not so much poking weapons, but more slashing weapons, more like a Celtic sword, but had a lot of influence on how they obtained that metal from the Roman Empire, because they used these peat bogs to get this iron. Now, as far as armor goes, they used chainmail, which was a Roman thing. They had helmets which were designed very similar to Roman helmets, with the cheek guards, your eye openings and ear openings, and the crest on the top of the helmet to prevent strikes from or blows from coming straight down, kind of giving that extra protection, which you can see a lot of in Roman helmets, while not letting the visuals or the hearing get obstructed due to the armoring. They also had reindeer hide armor, which was not Roman, but it's important to add in this slide. The last thing is they had the standardized forts. Now, only 4 of these have been found, but they are identical to each other. It is a circular wall made out of dirt with a wooden exterior to kind of support it. It had ramparts and a moat and 4 entrances to it, and these very, I guess, identical setups of these 4 smaller common areas with, stables and places for iron workers and, forges and whatnot. But these forts are spread over Europe, and they're worth a little bit of research if you're interested in it. For those who remember, the Roman forts were built extremely similar with an identical setup in each fort that they went to. Now, one thing that was not very Roman is the concept of the Berserkers. These are like the elite of the Viking groups. Now, they were in a fighting trance state where they would possibly chew on their shields or, do all these other crazy acts. And there's some speculation that these individuals were either drunk or they were drugged on some type of psychedelic mushroom or something like that. But they were fighting warriors who just gave everything that they could to these fights. And the word berserker comes from the pelts, like the bears or the wolf pelts that they used. But honestly, most of them probably fought naked, which is scary in itself. When you have a huge, naked, strong person swinging an axe around at you, you're not exactly trying to stick around if you're a lonely peasant from England. Now, the interesting side note I found out from listening to a great podcast is after these Vikings went on this rage, this berserker trance, most of them were extremely useless after that. They were almost like children, just sitting around. And it was actually kind of a joke in the ancient world that these strong men eventually became, docile. Now, guys, probably the most important piece of technology that came from the Vikings were their longships. It doesn't really seem like that big of a deal, but these ships were 57 to 120 foot long-ish. They could go anywhere from 12 to 30 miles an hour on the water, and they carried anywhere from 20 to 60. I've actually heard numbers much larger than this, too, on some of their larger ships, up to 100 soldiers. Now, just a side note, the sail on these things, which this is missing the sail on, because this is an actual longship that was discovered, the sails were worth more than the rest of the ship most of the time. Why these were important were not so much because they were just good ships, but it was the fact that they could go anywhere. They were fast. They drafted very little water, so they could go up rivers. They pretty much made any waterway a way that soldiers could be sent from point A to point B. They were extremely light, so even if you got to really shallow water, which you could not, boat through, you could pick your boat up and carry it across the land, and then that just gave that projected military power, the ability to fight farther away from one's homeland. It just increased it even more. So let me hit you guys with a few more generalizations. This is our last slide. Why were the Vikings so successful? This is just some little hits. Things like the longship, as I just mentioned, it was a tactical weapon. It was used to not only get troops from point A to point B, but it was used to flank one's enemy or to bypass a main enemy or a main army in order to target a less trained peasant army or a less fortified city. For instance, if a Saxon garrison came to a city and they were defending it with their best and strongest troops, the Vikings, instead of directly attacking these soldiers, would simply just go around them and then fight all the cities around those towns, because they knew it would take a very long time for that very slow land force to move from point A to point B. The other thing is the Vikings were really big on settlements and making little forts here and there, or little towns here and there. And this is important not only for trade, but most importantly for logistics, so they could have this military that was fighting at all times during the year. It was not dedicated to a fighting season like we saw in a lot of Europe at the time. Now, these soldiers, were trained from childhood. They were a professional force. And this is very similar to how when the Roman legion showed up into an area, they would just destroy whoever they were fighting against because they were soldiers. When we think of the movie 300, how many soldiers did the Greeks bring? Not. Next up are the Viking settlements, which were all over the place in order to not only increase trade, because these men were mainly tradesmen, but also to help with logistics, to allow them to fight farther away from home for that projected military power, and to allow them to fight during the non-traditional warring seasons, because, as most of Europe is only fighting during certain times of the year, the Vikings were a professional force, so they were fighting all the time. These soldiers were trained from childhood, making them a professional force, very similar to how the Romans were a professional force, the legionaries. They had Glima, which was a martial arts, which was taught from childhood to women, men, and children. And then you have just the basic war tactics, where they use sneak attacks, hit-and-go tactics, and things like the feigned retreat, which we learned about in the Roman week. Also, religion actually played a big part on their success. Religious sites were not protected well, so they could target those sites. But most importantly, English thought that religion would protect them. So when they signed these treaties, they would get the Vikings to swear on crosses and other religious relics. And to the Vikings, they were like, what is Odin going to do to me if I betray this pact with him that I made on a bracelet? So to them, religion did not stand in their way as far as conquering, whereas religion hindered the Christians in England because they were expecting divine intervention to protect them. Finally, we have culture, so this honor to die on the battlefield, this promise of going to places like Valhalla, their gods, things like that, major positives when it comes to their success, and finally, as mentioned before, their weaponry. So why does all this matter? Well, Vikings gave us a lot on tactics, on military prowess. They gave us the days of the week, which you guys can look into in more detail. They gave us this really cool culture that helps influences things like TV shows and movies. It gives us our mascots. I went to a school that was a Viking. There's songs that are sung about Vikings to this day. Heavy metal bands rely on this stuff. Artwork is dedicated to them. There's even drinks named after them and other drinks that are made in just like they were made back in the day. So guys, even considering all this stuff except for this TV show, which was pretty garbage, you should really enjoy the Vikings. So thank you guys for listening, and I hope you have a great week.